All right. I think everyone is, I think there are still some people. Oh, yep. I think folks have gotten in. Um, Welcome everyone to Dartmouth's Conversations on South Asia series. I'm Thara Suri. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion of Professor Devika Shankar's wonderful new book, An Encroaching Sea: Nature, Sovereignty, and Development at the Edge of British India. Just you can get a sense of the multiple layers of encroachment from the very cover here that Professor Shankar will be discussing. Professor Shankar is joining us today along with Professor David Ludden and Dr. Vidya Ravindranathan, who will serve as discussants. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to express our thanks to Faiza Rahman, postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows, who has been coordinating this series throughout the year. And thanks as well to Navya Bardwaj, who has been serves as our BODES undergraduate fellow, has been doing all of the background work to make this happen, and to Hope Rennie, who is department administrator in Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages. I would be remiss not to thank the departments that have sponsored this event: ASCL, the BODES Fund, and the departments of Anthropology, History, Sociology, and Environmental Studies. We will begin today with a presentation from Professor Shankar, followed by comments from Professor Ludden and Dr. Ravindranathan. Let me introduce our panelists, and then I will stop talking. Um, Professor Devika Shankar is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Hong Kong. She is a historian of modern South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. Her research interests lie in the fields of environmental history, economic history, and science and technology studies, research interests that have all come together in this work, An Encroaching Sea, and her work on water laws, princely sovereignty, and land acquisition in South Asia has been published by CSSH, past and present, CSSAME, and more. I will also introduce our panelists as a way of getting myself out of the way. So Professor David Ludden is Professor Emeritus at New York University and the University of Pennsylvania. His research and teaching focus on South Asian history, long-term globalization, and capitalist development regimes. In addition to his many monographs, edited volumes, and articles on South Asian history, Professor Ludden has chaired South Asia programs at Penn, NYU, Fulbright, American Council of Learned Societies, and the Social Science Research Council, and he has also served as the president of the Association for Asian Studies. I know that all of these bios are tremendously inadequate. And finally, Vidya Ravindranathan is Dr. Vidya Ravindranathan is a visiting fellow at the Center for British Studies at Humboldt, Berlin. She is a historian specializing in early colonial India and completed a dissertation at the University of Göttingen on the evolution of wage labor relations alongside legal and bureaucratic frameworks established by the East India Company in the port city of Madras. She has been the recipient of fellowships from the German Historical Institute, the European Research Council, and NYU, and has publications in journals such as History Compass and others. So we will turn to Professor Shankar to present on her book, followed by remarks from our discussants. Please take it away, Professor Shankar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. Thanks to you and Faiza for organizing this event. To David and Vidya for taking the time to engage with my book. It's really, I've learned a lot from their work on port cities over the years. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion later. So to begin with, I'll just very quickly begin by saying that my book, An Encroaching Sea, very broadly, and I'll talk more about this in the next 10 minutes or so, looks at the history of coastal erosion along parts of India's southwestern coastline and looks at how different states, colonial, princely, and post-colonial, to a lesser extent, have dealt with this issue since the late 19th century. So for the purpose of this presentation, what I thought I'd do is briefly talk a little bit about how this project began, how I first started thinking about Kochi and thinking about coastal erosion, and through that, give you hopefully a sense of some of the broader questions that this book looks at. And I thought, for the purpose of this discussion, going back to the start might be particularly fruitful, because I think how I got into this project has shaped this book in for better or worse. Um, so this project began in 2014, so more than 10 years ago now, which is when I'd gone for my first archival trip during my PhD to one of the three branches of the Kerala State Archives in the city of Calicut or Kozhikode. But I'd originally gone to Kozhikode with a very different project in mind. So in 2014, I still thought of myself as an urban historian. And so what I wanted to do was to write a sort of urban history of Kozhikode in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is a period when Calicut was very much a city in decline. And I wanted to look at urban transformations in Kozhikode as a way of looking at wider transformations in the Indian Ocean region. So I was looking at a lot of trade reports, I was looking at a lot of revenue records, and very soon I was beginning to feel very bored, very lost, and not quite sure about what to do with all of this quantitative data that I was collecting about changing trade patterns, etc. Luckily for me, during that time when I was looking at the revenue records, I began to notice some intriguing looking index entries, not to do with Kozhikode, but to do with a port city further to the south called Kochi. And these index entries were titled things like encroachment of the sea and several sort of variations on this theme. And I began to notice that there was a real proliferation of index entries like this in the revenue records from the 1860s onwards. So initially, I just began to requisition these documents just out of curiosity. But this is how I first began to learn about the issue of coastal erosion. This is also how I first began to see correspondence dealing or referring to the particular issues caused by coastal erosion around Kochi, which is eventually what my book ended up looking at. So from the correspondence that I first started looking at in the Kozhikode archives, there firstly seemed to be, as I said, a surge of interest in coastal erosion within the colonial establishment, in the issue of coastal erosion around Kochi from the 1860s onwards, and also a sense that coastal erosion around Kochi was different in scale, intensity, and nature from coastal erosion in other parts of the world, because coastal erosion is, of course, a fairly common problem in various places, in various coastal regions. And a large part of the reason why there seemed to be this sense that coastal erosion was a particularly big issue in Kochi had to do with Kochi's location. So Kochi, as you can see, the Kochi Harbour sort of lies on this narrow strip of land that is considered to be geologically relatively young. And so as coastal erosion started appearing or making its presence felt more clearly from the 1860s, there was a sense, firstly, that these strips of land might erode and might be washed away completely, and that might affect the harbor, but that might also have ripple effects throughout this region. So there was a lot of correspondence from the 1860s and 70s looking at the reasons why coastal erosion actually increasing? Why was it increasing? What were the possible reasons? So a lot of investigations that were sort of focused on Cochin and its sort of changing coastline. And so there was a lot of anxiety as well, and a lot of sort of petitions from various sorts of coastal communities asking for some sort of state intervention. But what I was also finding in this correspondence was that during this time, the Madras government, which is the provincial government under which this district fell, was completely disinterested in any sort of in investing in any sort of coast protection works during this period. Because these lands were considered to be low value lands. They were not very productive. So even as a lot of petitions were appearing in the archive, there also seemed to be a sense that the state was not going to intervene in any sort of significant way. So these were the first set of records that I looked at as far as Kochi was concerned. But at this point, I was still sort of thinking of working on my original research project. I thought maybe I'll do a side sort of, I'll write another article on Kochi and perceptions of nature here. Um, I only changed my mind about this and decided to shift my focus to Kochi entirely when I came across a set of documents on the Kochi Harbour project from the early 20th century. So the Kochi Harbour project is a fairly well-known development project in southwestern India. It leads to Cochin's harbour because the Cochin had this natural harbour. It leads to Cochin's harbour being dredged, opened up to steamships, and allows Cochin to emerge at the time of India's independence as India's fourth most important port behind only Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. Um, so when I started requisitioning documents on Kochi in the late 19th century, the archivist at the Kozhikode Archives, who's Majid sir, who was really amazing, he told me that the Kozhikode Archives had this one set of documents on the Kochi Harbour project. But initially, so he was sort of encouraging me to look at this. But initially, I wasn't really that keen on looking at these records because I thought I'd find a lot of correspondence from and about the usual suspects. European merchants and colonial officials debating the pros and cons of having a project, developing this port. I thought I'd find a lot of material from the Navy because Kochi does eventually become a naval base. And from what I knew about the project, I thought that the Navy was involved from the very beginning. But when I did eventually look at these records, these were not the issues, and these were not the sort of actors that I was finding. Instead, a couple of things that I wasn't really expecting to find that much of in a set of documents about port development kept popping up over and over again. The first of these was coastal erosion. Now, as I said at the end of I'd been reading about how coastal erosion had been intensifying from in the late 19th century. I was reading about how it was sort of leading to greater anxieties around the port and around the sort of safety of the entire coastline. And I'd been reading about how the colonial state throughout the late 19th century wasn't really keen on investing in any sort of coast protection in this region. Now, from the records on the Cochin Harbour project, it became clear that the problem of coastal erosion had in fact intensified significantly by this time, or at least there was a perception within the colonial establishment that coastal erosion had become worse. And there were at least some officials who seemed to be suggesting that parts of the coastline might soon now be submerged. Now, interestingly, it was precisely at this time, as fears around Cochin submergence and the harbour sort of submergence increase, that the colonial state does finally agree to invest in a port development project in Kochi. So up until this period, so demands for port development in Kochi begin to be articulated from the late 19th century. This was a period, of course, when port development projects were being executed in different parts of the Indian Ocean. But again, the government of India and the Madras government were not really interested in developing Kochi. The British had spent a lot of money on developing Colombo. They were also investing a lot in Madras and Bombay, and they really didn't think that there was a need for another big port in this region. But in the 1910s, just when fears about Cochin's coastline begin to increase, the colonial state does finally agree to invest in a port development project. Now, this struck me as a little odd. I still hesitate to call myself an environmental historian, but I was definitely not one in 2014. But the few sort of classic environmental histories that I had read were often sort of discussed ecological instability as consequences of technological interventions. But what was happening in Kochi seemed to be slightly different. Here was a period of ecological instability and a period of growing anxiety around the environment, sort of almost contributing to the decision to embark or to invest in a port development project. The second thing I was surprised to find in these sources was a lot of correspondence from the princely states of the region. So princely states were semi-sovereign territories where British rule was exercised indirectly. And one of the interesting things about Cochin's location was that Cochin was a British port, so the harbour was under the British. But the port was sort of surrounded by two princely states, as you can see in this map. A tiny state that was also called Cochin, this was the Cochin state, and a bigger state called Travancore further to the south. Um, Now, when I sort of started looking at these records, I'd assumed that the Cochin Harbour project was yet another colonial state-led development project. But from these records, it became clear that actually this project was executed by the colonial state in partnership with both of these princely states. Now, this is again quite unusual in the South Asian context. There are many cases where the British get involved with infrastructure development projects in princely states. But it is quite rare for princely states to get involved with development projects in British India. But what was even more remarkable in the case of Cochin was that over the course of the Kochi Harbour project, the tiny state of Cochin that sort of surrounds the harbour on three sides starts using international law to try and extend its jurisdiction over parts of the British port. And it does so, and it's sort of trying to do so in the 1920s and 30s, which are really interesting decades as far as constitutional changes in South Asia are concerned. So when I did eventually decide to shift my focus to Kochi and to sort of work on and to look at or to sort of write this history of the developments leading up to the Kochi Harbour project, the two questions that I began with and that in many ways still lie at the heart of my book. Were firstly, why did increasing ecological instability sort of contribute to the execution of a port development project, which is a very specific kind of intervention? Why does a growing sort of sense of anxiety around the coastline lead to a very particular kind of, or the decision to intervene in a very particular kind of way? And the second is, how does a princely state get involved with the development project in British India, and how then does it use it to extend its sovereignty over a port in British India in the years before decolonization? So I sort of address these questions over 5 chapters. I'm going to be very brief. I won't go into the details of each of the chapters. I start in the 1960s, and my first chapter sort of looks at the way in which coastal erosion and other coastal transformations begin to attract attention towards Kochi's coastline and create this idea of Cochin's environment as being particularly anomalous and unusual. The second chapter turns to the princely states and looks at how these two states become more entangled with the British port financially over the course of the late 19th century. The third chapter looks at how this increasing entanglement of the princely states with the British ports affairs on the one hand, and increasing coastal erosion on the other hand, starts sort of creating complications, political and environmental complications for the colonial state by the early 20th century. And it looks at why a development project emerges or comes to be seen as a preferred solution to both of these concerns during this time. And the last two chapters sort of look at the fallout of the sort of interventions that are executed through the Kochi Harbour project. And in these chapters, I use the Kochi Harbour project as a sort of window into the wider constitutional debates that are taking place in South Asia during this time. So this is a period when various kinds of political arrangements are being discussed, including the idea of a federation between involving princely states and provinces in British India. And because the Cochin Harbour project is a development project that involves the Madras government, it involves the government of India, and it involves two princely states, I sort of use that as a way of looking at these wider sort of changes and wider debates and discussions that are taking place during this time. So ultimately, and I'm going to end with this, through this sort of case study of port development in Cochin, my book tries to do two things. First, as far as environmental history is concerned, it seeks to complicate usual approaches to colonial interventions. So while my book remains attentive to the violence of technological interventions executed during colonial rule and their adverse ecological consequences, which is something that many generations of environmental historians in South Asia and elsewhere have discussed at length, it also highlights the cruelty of abandonment and neglect and shows just how the lack of intervention along parts of India's southwestern coastline has historically been as devastating as ill-conceived interventions. So it considers intervention and non-intervention together and probes the conditions under which different states have been prepared to intervene and in what form. Second, with regard to law and empire, my book highlights previously unacknowledged challenges to British territorial sovereignty in the era of decolonization. Throughout the high imperial period, infrastructure development projects like the Suez Canal had, of course, served as popular means of extending European jurisdiction and sovereignty across the world. The very different turn of events at Kochi, therefore, provides us with an opportunity to probe transformations witnessed during late colonialism and to complicate the usual story of decolonization in South Asia. So I'm going to stop there and I'll look forward to your questions and comments. Should I stop?
Thank you, Professor Shankar. Professor Ludden, would you like to respond first?
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Devika. Well, as you know, I've been sort of involved with this project for a long time, and it's nice to see the book come out and how nice it is.
Professor Ludden,
Yeah.
could you increase the volume of your computer?
Increase the volume of the computer. I have no idea. Is it too? I mean, you want me to speak louder? Is that it?
If you can.
I can speak louder. Yeah, sure. In order to do that, in order to change the volume, I'd have to do some messing around with the settings. And
No,
so
this
on.
is fine. I think as long as you speak a
I
little
just was,
louder, that's fine.
I'm not. Yeah, okay. I'm a little bit under the weather, so I was being a little bit
Okay.
under volume. I will increase the volume. Yeah, I've been involved with this project in various ways for a long time, and I really appreciate seeing it, how nice it looks and getting to the state that it's in, and it's really terrific. But the other thing is, as Devika well knows, I never stay still in terms of thinking about things, so that I'm actually interested in two issues that she raised at the very beginning. One was the connection between this work and the contemporary situation, and the other was that set of empirical data that she ignored when she was in Korikore. You know, when she was in the archive, she got bored with the data. Now, the problem with this problem is that there's a lot of data that's very boring, that has a lot of really important stuff in it. And it's hard to process. And I think that there's an interesting problem here when it comes to the development of projects. And so now we have a bunch of graduate students, hopefully out there in the world of this webinar, who can basically hear this problem unfolding. And Devika did a pretty good job of telling how it works, which is that you go to the date, you go where the evidence is taking you, where the evidence seems to be most available, where it looks like it's also where it's handling the kinds of problems that are most prominent in the profession and your universities and so on, you know. And in this case, of course, the problem is colonialism, or the colonial state, so to speak. And the obsession with South Asian historians in general is with the colonial state and the colonialness of the state. Okay, now that is an interesting situation to point out. But what I'd like to suggest is it's not the only way of looking at Cochin or any other place in South Asia. And the colonialness of the colonial state is actually part of a larger set of problems having to do with the way in which places in South Asia were integrated into the world of interactions and human relations and so on. And focusing on the state's relations with the environment, which is this ends up being, you can see there's a kind of an interesting structural feature to this analysis having to do with the state on the one side and the environment on the other. So you've got a kind of a, a historical sort of massaging of a topic so as to fit right into what you might call some trends in the literature. What I'm going to suggest is it would be really interesting to try to think about alternative trends that we might think about developing. And you, Devika, of course, has raised them several times, but then, shall we say, buried them along the way. One of them has to do with the fact is who is using this harbor? I mean, who are the actual people who are there? Who are the people who are interacting with the place? Who is in this place? Where are they coming from? Where are they going? What are they doing? What are their interests and so on? There's various indications of it in the text. There's some lobbyists that show up here and there, and there's a various texts that show this up. But the thing is about governments is that governments in general, although they collect lots of data that help us get at these levels of interaction and human activity, they don't necessarily integrate that into their policy formulations in such a way as to actually make them visible as a kind of a subject matter. I just had a recent, really great, we just had a lecture at SOAS the other day on the question on these 17th century records from Kolkata concerning the everyday problems of debt and of debt payment and so on by weavers and so on, things that were not in the colonial or the British East India Company policy framework, but which are actually there's lots of records concerning these actual, everyday transactions and so on. So I think there's a couple of things that I would say. One is actually just a kind of a reaction to the logic of the formulation of the research program, which is to say that it's interesting the extent to which the research program is driven by this combination of the availability of records, which of course the state really wants you to do, right? The state wants your work to be about the state. And then there's the question of the other kinds of themes that end up becoming important. And those themes are contemporary themes. So environmental history, erosion, sea road change, and so on and so forth. These have become, sort of important themes today. But I think that there are other important, neoliberalism also shows up in the discussion at the beginning. But the subject of neoliberalism is a policy concerning the operation of the market and capitalist investors. And so this is where the issue that I have sort of comes in, which is I'd like Devika, because I'm sure she, has lots of stuff about this. And I'm hoping that maybe we can, push her in the direction of doing more of this in the future, having to do with Cochin as a global site. Cochin is not just a place inside South India. Cochin is a very old harbor area. I mean, it's, there's like 20 ports all along the coast there between, on the west coast. Cochin is one of a whole series of little ports that were there for, hundreds of years. I mean, the Romans are showing up there. I mean, the Portuguese and the Arabs and everybody else in the world is showing up there. So this is not just a place in British India. So this is an interesting issue. Okay, the other part of it was the hinterland. Now, the thing is, any kind of port would have a hinterland. And this is where the native state, this is where Cochin and Travancore obviously come in. And this is why, of course, Madras presidency thought as a minor issue, because the hinterland of this port, the people who are going to benefit in the interior most immediately were not in British India. So they were in Travancore and Cochin. What one suspects, we don't know. What's going out of the port? What are the products that are going out? Who's invested in the port? What kind of where is this stuff going? Where is it coming from? All of that sort of mobile histories of everything that's moving in and out of the port. I think that the stories of those mobilities is really actually what ties the project of the present, of the past to the present. The state policy formulation of it is a little bit, is there. You could talk about the way in which the government of India is dealing with the ports today, and the state government of Kerala and so on. But again, I would like to see a discussion both from Devika, now and in the future maybe, but also to have a discussion about the nature of the construction of research projects having to do with the extent to which their historians are currently trapped inside some kind of statist, sort of obsession with, colonialism and independence and so on and so forth. I mean, and how that might become unraveled in a day, like in a period that we're in now, where I think the idea of city-centered globalization that happens to be involved in various different forms of legal structure might be more, might help us to open up the subject matter to a little bit more social history, economic history, sort of, all those areas that seem to be going down the drain these days. They've asked me at Penn to talk about agrarian history, and I was shocked. I said, people are interested in agrarian history, and they said yes, and I can't believe it. But that's because it's just not trendy. Economic history is nowhere to be found. Social history is, sort of dissipated because these records are hard to use. They're really difficult, time consuming, and we don't have time. Now, more of them are digitalized now, I will say. There's more and more stuff online. There's more and more stuff you can get. But still, I have to say, this kind of stuff that really has the details is not going to get digitalized for a while. And in fact, it probably will go into the trash when the archives, run into financial problems. So digging down into these more obscure, harder to use records that are more likely to be able to provide data on the day-to-day nitty-gritty of actual living experiences in these ports, and the mobilities that are being focused there could be really something that has some urgency to it. I have to say, even just in terms of trying to preserve the records that are there. The end. I'll shut up. I probably went on too long, as usual. Thanks so much.
Do you want me to respond, or should we wait for Vidya?
What would you prefer, Devika?
I think I can respond if that's okay.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thanks so much, David. I mean, we've had these conversations a few times now. And so it's nice and I think that I've really gained a lot from, sort of being pushed in this direction. So I agree with you in many ways, but there are certain things that, where I think, so firstly, let me just begin by saying, the reason I want to start by talking about how this project came to be. And as I said, and you're completely right, that in a sense, and that's what I began with, which is that I think that, sometimes now I think about, if I had looked at the same issues, but not because I sort of stumbled on these records, but because I'd started looking at coastal erosion in the contemporary context, and started, that the book would have, I think, looked quite different. And so so sometimes I wonder what would that book have looked like. And I think so. I should say that I have a lot of those Calicut records, David. So if you're interested, I have them. I still have photos from the Korakod archive. So I'm happy to share them with you. I think they're very important records. I just didn't feel like I was the best person to deal with them. But I think somebody really should. And I think there's a wealth of material, especially in a lot of these archives in places like Kerala, that are just woefully underutilized. And I think that they can be used in various ways. I think as far as the colonial state is concerned, I think that I mean, definitely this is very much from, I mean, my questions are all about the state, but I don't think that my interest is only in the colonial state. In fact, I think a large part of what I'm trying to do is to look at other kinds of, especially the princely states, and to not just sort of say that this is another sort of state to just add to the mix, but I think it does make a difference. I think a lot of the histories of development that have been very statist have almost entirely been focused on the colonial state. And for me, the princely states, and in fact, what I say in the book is also that this project wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have been completed if it was just for the colonial state, for various reasons. It's ultimately financed almost entirely by the princely state. And as far as I know, this is one of the only such projects happening in British India that is being financed by two princely states. But to go beyond that, I think even more sort of, to sort of engage with your question about the social questions, which are of course very important. But I also did think, while looking at these issues and while looking at these sources, that actually I think there hasn't been enough that's been written on how states or how certain places were transformed into ports in colonial India. We actually sort of take a lot of these questions about colonial, the financing of ports, for granted. But actually, I think the financing of ports in India, for instance, is actually extremely complicated. I don't think I've still figured it out. And I at least couldn't find any sort of texts that really deal with these issues. There's been so much that's been written on the railways, for instance, on the canals, that have looked at various aspects of the state sort of involvement in these infrastructure projects. But I think, and now there's so much work happening with anthropologists, for instance, now looking at how states and private players, etc., are remaking coastlines into certain kinds of hubs. But I mean, if I look at the 19th and 20th centuries, there are so much of the port literature is focused on port cities, it's focused on urban issues, and the actual remaking of coastlines into ports. And I might be wrong, and maybe there are certain sort of texts that I missed, but at least in the South Asian context, there aren't many that I can think of that really, and I think those processes, so I actually think more work needs to be done, because as I said, there is a lot about how these processes work. That I was also working on Tutukudi, which is another project that happens around the same time. And there are just various issues around how certain projects get financed or don't get financed, etc. So that's one set of things. So I think that it's true, and I think that but I do know that other people are writing social histories focused on Kochi. So so I think, and I think that if I had, this book could have looked quite different if I had sort of looked at certain other issues. At the same time, I think a lot the sort of issues that I was looking at did require a certain amount of sort of space to explore in the way that I felt like I needed to. Um, as far as things like climate change and contemporary issues are concerned, I actually did not start with this project with these things in mind at all. At the time, today, coastal erosion has become a very big issue in Kerala, with the Adani port being developed, etc. Coastal erosion has been leading to a huge amount of very interesting kinds of popular mobilization. And this has happened especially since 2017 onwards. But for me, the thing that was frustrating once I started work, so I had already started looking at Kochi, and I wasn't quite sure, how to exactly which aspects of this to focus on. And during that time, I started seeing a lot of news reportage on coastal erosion in the Kochi context. And one of the things that was frustrating to me was just how the discussions were focused on coastal erosion as a problem that is only happening now. It was all about how this is a problem that started in the 1980s, 1990s, and looking at various sorts of factors that had contributed to it. And I just thought that that actually there is, but I think they're related. Today, the Adanis are using climate change as a reason to not sort of take responsibility for coastal erosion taking place in and around in just south of Kochi. So I think all of these issues are related, whether it's the contemporary issues, the long history of these changes. And I think that, I think that these, I mean, I get that, some of this might, can also seem like gesturing towards certain trendy topics, but I can assure you, I mean, everyone has to do a bit of that, I suppose, when you want to get published. But at the same time, I do feel like in this case, I thought that I did not think this was just something added on. I actually think coastal erosion is a really interesting way, which I don't think I developed enough in this book. But I wish, and if I was doing this again, I think I would have looked at it in more detail, which is how the temporality of coastal erosion as a form of coastal change is actually something that is quite useful as a way of looking at the slowness of issues or of changes that we usually associate with climate change. It sort of explodes in certain moments, but usually seen as a more slower and harder to perceive problem. That's is there anything else that I've missed?
I just
Maybe
like
should
to
we
say,
go
could I
to?
just say one thing?
Yes,
I
sure.
wasn't talking about you writing a book that you didn't, I mean, right, that you weren't, that the book was, this is a really important book. This is a really important book. And I think everything you've said is exactly right on with respect to the importance of this book now, right? Okay. I was actually even thinking about, I'm always thinking about the future, right? I'm thinking about where does one go when thinking about these problems once the Devika problem has been solved? What's the next problem that you work on? And I think that you indicated some of that here. One has to do with the way in which the experience of this environmental problem and state policy, sort of operates within the users of the port, the people who are moving through the port. The other thing has to do with the investors, and I think that this is where the linkage would really come. Is to put it bluntly, where are the capitalist interests that are really involved in this? The state policy is actually at some level removed from the actual everyday interests of the capitalists who are actually invested in these things. So anyway, I wasn't saying that this is a really important book. Don't get me wrong. This is really great. And it's on sort of onward and upward from here. And thanks a lot.
Shall we move to comments from Dr. Ravindranathan? Vidya, I know that your camera doesn't work, but we're looking forward to hearing from
I'm
you.
so sorry. The
No
camera
worries.
is just
No,
not working.
not. We're all living in this world where we have mishaps with our computers.
First of all, thank you so much. I mean, it was a great pleasure to sort of read the book. I think it's one of the most reader friendly and brilliantly written book of late that I've read. So I'm very happy that I got to read it so closely. So thank you to the organizers. I think I'll just begin with, because a lot of my intervention comes from the perspective of a lot of work that I've done on the study from the perspective of infrastructure studies, and something that just sort of came up. I mean, during the course of the discussion about, I thought that would be a good way to sort of begin this. So I was thinking in terms of Devika, how sort of how your work is actually helping us rethink the study of infrastructure from the question from the perspective of the princely state politics, right? And there's a whole lot of literature that of late have helped us sort of rework some of the entrenched assumptions that have been sort of perpetuated by the older historiography, which has got to do with the fact that public works project was all about technological dominance, transfer of technology, colonial state expansion. A lot of work that has come up have sort of provided more nuanced approaches which have located public works projects and infrastructural transformations within specific local contexts. So they have questioned the permanent stability and homogeneity that we sort of assume that these projects have. And I mean, I'm thinking of a whole lot of works that have come up in the 2000s, basically. So one thing I was thinking in terms of, and they have questioned the civilizational rhetoric of the colonial state, the naturalness and utility of public work. So they have in many ways questioned what is the whole idea of public works being a natural, universal public good that is beneficial to all. So I was just thinking that how would your work sort of engage with this sort of literature from the perspective of the princely state? Because I just thought that I mean, can we think of different concepts? Do you think that there are ways in which the idea of public good would work out differently in the context of the princely state politics? Because I was just thinking, these are the ways in which the existing historiography has questioned some of the assumptions or prevailing assumptions about colonial about infrastructural transformation is from the perspective of the colonial state. So does the whole the way in which you have positioned the princely state story, does it really in what ways it helps us rethinking this canon which has sort of emerged over the couple of years? So that's something that I was sort of interested in knowing more about. And the other thing, of course, I mean, I think that your work is breaking a lot of new ground because, and you mentioned it earlier, instead of presuming a causal link between the imperatives of colonial expansion and construction of infrastructures for dominating nature, Devika's book locates it within a particular conjuncture of political and ecological forces. So again, I would really I'm very interested in understanding in terms of if we think about if we think about the political through the perspective of the princely state, how does it sort of help us rethink a whole lot of these concepts that we have sort of that have been associated with in our analysis of infrastructural transformation? Do you think that more vernacular, local, grounded concepts that are emerging, for instance, from that context that you talk about, would that help us in, say, rethinking the idea of the public good, right? And so I think that this is a very fantastic, fascinating point that you bring in. But I was just thinking in the context of how different would these political conflicts between the princely state and the colonial state, how would it help us rethink the idea of the public works or infrastructure as a project? And I think you've also sort of very interestingly displaced the primacy that is often attributed to colonialism and to also economic concerns, and you have sort of made the political contest and the ecological, the fragile ecology at the center. And here, I mean, what was interesting was that nature is not a silent, passive entity waiting to be dominated. It deeply informs and determines the nature of the technological fix. And it's also goes beyond the more received understanding of nature that we think of when we think of nature and colonial state formation. We are automatically thinking of landscapes being molded, right, or transformed. So here in that sense, I felt that it was not nature is something that is constantly, it's sort of very deeply layered in your analysis. It's interpenetrated, and I mean penetrating your political your understanding of political conflicts, and it's not something that's easily malleable. And what is interesting is that it was not even the foremost priority of the state until the early 20th century. So it's a very interesting way in which the nature is actually given a lot of agency, and also, of course, there's a whole lot of way in which I mean, I wouldn't use the word agency, but a whole lot of way in which I was thinking there are multiple or plural natures that are actually, working around through, that work through your book. So there is no one single definition of nature that is, easily conquered or easily sort of. So in that sense, I think this was conceptually a very interesting point. Um, I think I understand that you have, as a historian and as when you're writing a book, you have a particular axis, and you have an lens through which you want to work with. But as somebody who is working on fishers and the whole coastal transformations and its effects on fishing communities, I was interested in understanding to what extent would you push your work to understand the social history of this port building project. Because I understand that, and I thought that what you mentioned in terms of the fishers being constantly seen as victims or as seen as adversaries and not seen as people who are deeply invested in, or demanding from the colonial state that certain kinds of, coastal protection schemes should be done. I think that was a very um, um, uh, interesting intervention there. But I was thinking if you had more, archival material on this, where you could actually um, sort of think about this, because of course, we want to sort of complicate the story beyond dispossession or beyond questions of, how or beyond questions of how fishermen are anti-development or pro-development, or so. What are the, if there are other instances where you sort of came across where fishers, because I'm thinking of I was thinking of another question regarding the whole, when we think about the port, who needs a port? The stakeholders seem to be the merchants and the princely states. So I was thinking that, did you come across petitions apart from the couple of two or three petitions that you've mentioned in your book? Were there like long standing, because this seems to be very in your conclusion, this seems to be the most important sort of aspect that you wanted to highlight. But I was wondering if you if you if you sort of didn't if you wanted to sort of bring in more of that, or why didn't you not bring in more of that sort of discussion in the colonial or during the period that you sort of mentioned. So that those were the sort of three or four questions. So again, I was interested in how these social structures sort of were impacted in relation to the evolving built and natural landscapes. What are the new ways in which we can think of where people were looking at, and also expand on the point that you mentioned, that this was not simply a question of dispossession or victimization, but it's actually a resistance against long-standing neglect of the colonial state. So it's not simply the fact that a port came and people's livelihoods were affected, but the fact that people were actually demanding that the coast should not be neglected. Finally, I was also thinking in terms of how would you sort of locate your work within, this whole literature on capitalism and nature, because on the one hand, you sort of argue that, this was not the colonial state. It was not that like, in the sense, you argue that there was a set of local forces, and it was not, the nature was controlling the nature was not the first thing that the colonial state sort of was invested um, in transforming. So I was thinking that, we are, I mean, so how would you sort of look at some of the critical political ecologists, environmental management frameworks, which sort of argue that nature is being transformed through technical reason. There's highly resource intensive development modes, or this sort of literature that sort of that sort of argues that nature is automatically transformed and mobilized to construct different landscapes of value. And so, yeah, I'll just leave at that. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Vidya. That was great. So what I'll do is I'll sort of start from the last question and maybe sort of go backwards. So these sort of new histories of capitalism and the sort of the has been very useful for me, and I think that it's something I'm still sort of reading. I just started reading Alyssa Battistoni's book Free Gifts, which just came out. I think I wish it had come out before I had written my book. It's sort of, I've been finding a lot of it just really interesting and useful. And I think it is useful, it has been useful for me because in a sense, I think that um, like a lot, Jason Moore or, that entire sort of, a lot of these scholars who are sort of coming from that tradition. I think that for me, the important thing is to think about all societies are transforming nature, right? We're all sort of, to live and to inhabit spaces to transform nature. But the way in which we do so is never the same. And it's like at different sort of points and under different systems, the way we transform nature, the choices that we make can be very different. And for me, from the beginning, that was the sort of the first sort of question that I got interested in is why are very particular kinds of interventions coming up in response to growing ecological instability. And I think that in that sense, and not just the newer sort of work, even people like Rohan D'Souza, whose work Drowned and Damned, which was I think published in 2006. I think that it also sort of interrogates how the structural sort of conditions that or the structures that certain kinds of economic configurations, whether it's capitalism or a certain sort of state formation, how that sort of creates very limited sort of choices. That for the colonial state, when you are in a place like Kochi, and I think that's one of the things that I try and discuss at the start of my book, which is that for me, Kochi's location and the fact that it's a fairly peripheral port city, that it's not a Bombay, it's not a Madras, it's not a Calcutta, is very important to understand why certain decisions are made in that context. If coastal erosion was threatening Bombay in the 1870s, the colonial state would not have just sort of let it be. It would sort of, when it's happening in Kochi, the calculations are a little different. And in all of those things, ultimately, it does come down to questions of value, and it comes down to what kinds of lands are valued. And there, I think it's not just the colonial state, but you're seeing a similar sort of logic of value operating even today. I think today you're seeing a lot more investment in coast protection, but that's also coming at a time when beaches in Kerala have become the biggest sort of draw for tourists, etc. So now there's a greater sort of there's a greater recognition, there's a lot of popular pressure, but there's also the state and various sorts of even various private players. They're all sort of interested and invested in keeping the beaches nourished and making sure that the replenishing the beaches, etc., which just wasn't the case earlier. And so I think, yes, I think the question of value, which all of these works really point to, it was very central to my work as well. Um, with regard to the question about fishing, petitions, and and the question, which I think goes back to something that David also brought up, And I sort of anticipated that you would sort of, because of your own work, that you would be sort of interested in this question as well, which is that I think that, as David said, and I think that you're also right in the sense that there is a lot of, various kinds of conflicts, various kinds of discussions taking place even in the late 19th century about whether the harbor should be first seen as a space of fishing or as a space or as a place that is largely should be geared towards the interests of navigation. And this is something that not just Kochi, even places like Bombay, these debates go back to the early 19th century. And by the 1860s and 70s, the government in Bombay passes various laws to restrict fishing stakes, for instance, being used anywhere close to the harbor. In Kochi, it's actually a little more complicated because most of the water around the harbor belongs to the Cochin state, and the Cochin state thinks fishing is very important. And so it's constantly renting out parts of the backwater and allowing its subjects to plant fishing stakes, much to the frustration of local port administrators who keep thinking that these fishing stakes are huge sort of hazards. So I think that, that dispossession is definitely part of the story. So I don't want to suggest that it's not. And I think there is what you do see in all of these cases, and which is when ports develop, it often happens at the cost of, and various other kinds of economies are marginalized. And in Kochi, that does happen as well. And there are various sorts of conflicts that emerge that I wasn't really able to. There was some stuff on fishing, which I initially started writing about as part of this book, and then it just didn't seem to fit with the rest of it. So I've sort of, I haven't done much with it. I've written on fishing in Bombay, elsewhere, and in Bengal, but it sort of, again, that sort of, I started getting interested in fishing in these other locations because of the material that I from Kochi, because in Kochi, fishing with stakes becomes fairly contentious. So I think, as David also said, and I think I agree with both of you in the sense that there are various other kinds of narratives and other kinds of issues that are also very important in as far as Kochi is concerned. And I think that, I know that, Justin Matthew, and I think he's writing a sort of more social sort of history of the port that's more focused on labor and things like that. So I think people are writing things, and I think that there is a lot more to be done as far as Kochi and as far as much of this coastline is concerned. I think as far as your questions about public works and public good in the context of princely states are concerned, I think that's a really interesting question. And I hadn't really thought about it directly. But I think, because I think that in a sense, in a certain limited sense, you can say that by the late 19th century, many of these princely states also internalized much of the logic of the colonial state. They also want to build railways in the same sort of way. They also have certain kinds of, they also are invested in certain kinds of improvement projects, etc. And that's not really surprising in the sort of context that we're talking about, and the global sort of, we're talking about a global economy at this point. And both the princely states in this region are very sort of involved and are very and really do want to take advantage of the opportunities that are emerging at the end of the late 19th century. But at the same time, I do think that I don't like, romanticizing these princely states and, almost as if as a counter to the colonial states, saying actually these guys were doing it all right. And, they had but I think, in a sense, but I think that at least as far as coastal changes around Kochi was concerned, I think they did have a slightly different sort of attitude towards at least the problem of coastal erosion. And I still have to think about what that really says about, in terms of how they sort of, what we can sort of deduce. I think a lot of princely states are also very different, so I wouldn't want to generalize on the basis of one princely state and sort of, but I do think that there is something very interesting there that you pointed to. I think that because I think princely states, and this is something that a lot of literature on the princely states has also pointed out, that they do imbibe certain ideas, and they do sort of adopt many of those ideas, but there are certain differences that you see. And at least in terms of the changes that I was looking at, I think there's a certain the reluctance to get involved with coast protection, which you see at least with the Madras government throughout the early 19th century, is, I think, far less so with the Cochin state. And there are various reasons for it. There are different pressures that the Cochin state has as well. It's also a really small state. And for the Cochin state, fishing, as I said, is very important. So a lot of the coastal communities that sort of are getting affected are important constituents for the Cochin state in different ways. So I think there are differences, but that's something that I think it's a really interesting sort of idea. And I think that something um, that I think, is sort of worth thinking about more broadly. Um, as far as nature, you had a comment about the way in which nature sort of appears in the book, and the way in which I sort of look at, or how, whether it's a princely state or other sort of, or the colonial state, how I sort of look at nature in relation to these other sort of players. So yes, I think that for me the interesting thing was that in the late 19th century, everyone who's all the correspondence and all the correspondence I was finding, people were writing about nature as having agency. People weren't writing about it something that you can just easily dominate, etc. And that's where this whole idea of Cochin as a really unusual space with all kinds of weird coastal transformations taking place sort of comes in, because that sort of leads to this perception that this is a particularly volatile area, because Cochin's on this narrow piece of land. Any sort of small change can lead to very big sort of big ripple effects, etc. And so I think that in a sense, even in a lot of there was, even though I don't think that is any longer the case, there was a more easy narrative that continues to be popular in a sense that, that still informs the way we think about the modern state, in a sense, which is that, it's just always looking for a technological fix, and it's always sort of, it just thinks it can just control nature, etc., and then things go wrong. And I don't think that this is inaccurate. I think the modern state obviously is that searching for a technological fix and seeking a technological fix is very much a feature of the modern state in different places. But I think for me, it's still, it's how and in what form and where the state does choose to intervene in certain forms is not uniform, right? And I think so much of the literature on, as I said earlier, so much of the sort of work that has looked at questions to do with infrastructure, that has looked at questions to do with control of the environment, has ended up looking at areas where intervention is the, or control of nature seems to almost appear like the reflex response, right? As I said, if I was looking at coastal erosion in Bombay, things would look very different. The colonial state would appear like it's just waiting to just like embank or, build groins, etc. But in a place like Kochi, that's why I think Kochi, in a sense, allows us to look at the state, and to look at its interventions from a slightly different angle, where nature is definitely seen to be a far more potent sort of force, because it's just not, in the way in which a lot of administrators are thinking about it, is a very fairly simple cost benefit sort of way of thinking about it, which continues even with the post-colonial state, which is, how much money is it worth spending lakhs of rupees on groins if this land itself is just like worth very little, it's hardly producing anything, etc. And that is something you see world over. This is not just happening but in places like Kochi, where that the answer to that is not that, of course, you need to protect these lands. You can see these calculations, I think, a little more clearly, and there you can see the sort of the discourse around nature is, I think, a little more extended and a little more complicated than in other sites like, say, Bombay or Calcutta, is what I sort of argue in the book. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Professor Shankar, for your responses, Professor Ludden and Dr. Ravindranathan for your comments. I want to invite, with the few minutes that we have left, any questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A function to ask. I will, if people have questions, you can use the time that we have to put them in. But in the meanwhile, I will take my privilege as moderator and ask a follow-up question of you, Devika, which is, I wanted to return to the kind of this, the themes around data and knowledge and power, and the gap between data collection and policy. One of the things I was most interested by as I was reading was that you really offer an account of the state's own encounter with its data. And you really get at that when you talk about, for instance, the state's forgetting of the Narakal mud bank, or when I'm speaking here of the colonial state, but princely states too own encounter with their data, but also that other moment in, I think, chapter 3, when you're talking about how they keep looking for documents to claim kind of sovereignty over the backwaters. And what I was really struck by in sort of the way you write about this is the attention to kind of state forgetting of its own archival data collection. And I wondered for us whether you use Ranajit Guha to turn us from hubris to anxiety, but I wonder whether you're also theorizing forgetting, and you're theorizing a kind of befuddlement, and how that might offer something as well to kind of theorizing the kind of the longstanding preoccupations that historians have with colonial archives.
Thanks so much for that, Tara. Yeah, I mean, so I should say here that, anxiety was something that I began with, and then increasingly I began to feel like I wasn't that sort of convinced by it. But then so it was a much bigger part of my book than it is now. But it's still there. And yeah, I think I was sort of, I think that Kochi, because of its very long sort of history compared to many other places, but like a lot of other port cities, of European occupation and European colonization of the harbor. What was, this sort of this obsession with the paper, or needing to go back to the paper trail, or trying to find the paper trail and failing to do it, I think was partly, it's sort of, what it does, I think, is also show what at different points or at different moments, what were the things that were considered to be not important enough to note down, and how that changed over time, and how that could create certain complications, and how those could sort of re-emerge at a later point, and sort of raise questions, as happens with sort of some of the documents involving legal questions around the harbor. And yeah, so I think that the with the Narakal mud bank that you talked about, again, it was less in a sense sort of forgetting of the or an archival sort of forgetting, more of a question, more that certain things only come to be seen as important enough to categorize or be thought of as a thing at a certain moment. But I think that it was sort of interesting to follow that over, how certain categories come up, how they then fall out, how they then sort of reappear in a different form and raise different kinds of questions. So yeah, so I think it's sort of it's interesting to think about about this question, because I mean the Cochin case, of course, because of its long history, has a particular sort of context. But I think this happens in any sort of in any location. There are just these things that you return to, and you that might sort of disappear and then reappear later on.
Thank you. On the note of disappearance and reappearance, I think we've just hit time, and I want to extend my thanks on behalf of the series to you, Professor Shankar, to you, Professor Ludden, and Dr. Ravindranathan for a really stimulating discussion, and also to Faiza for all the coordinating work that goes into it. But an opportunity for us all to disappear and hopefully reappear in a new session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much to all of you as well. Thanks, David and Vidya. Thank you so much. This was great. I've sort of, your work was like, something I was constantly thinking about, especially in the last sort of stretches of like writing my PhD and the book. So it was very useful to have you read, and it was very nice to have you read and engage with my book. And thanks so much, Tara and Feza, for all the for putting
Thank
this.
you. Thank you, Devika. I had a question to ask you, but it had to do with like sort of your next project. Like what now that, I mean, you're at the University of Hong Kong, right? So I was just wondering, like, what is it that you're thinking now after this?
So I'm not sure, David, if you have any suggestions, please do send them my way. But right now I'm thinking of, I don't really know. I think that, this time I want to be more deliberate about what I do my second project on. I don't want to just go to the archives and then stumble on something.